infrastructure matters hugely. And there are behavioural aspects about this that are, yes, they're to do with the way you and I and the so-called end users use energy, but they're also to do with the behaviour of the policymakers and the industrialists and all these people. So there are these qualitative, social, political issues going on that are going to affect us for a long time.
As well as being a social scientist, I'm also a policy official. You know, I have those two hats, and I understand the language of policy. I understand the things that they're looking for, the processes and the structures that are being used. So, and getting them internally as well to understand whether or not their criteria are legitimate or fair, given the nature of research in social science, is also important to make sure that the presentation of information isn't, if you like, crushed beneath a kind of culture which sort of denies that kind of approach.
Welcome. I'm C. Rotman. This is Ruth Maurik. We are the two operating agents for Task 24, and we are incredibly thrilled to have you all here.
Models that are really in use are broadly economic by default. And of course, there's a lot of implicit and kind of what you might call naive theorizing. You're not really sort of thinking through, you're not choosing, oh, I'm going to look at the theory of planned behavior. They're models that are linked directly to the here and now, to real data, to get to the crux of the matter, but it's this matter here with these people now with this kind of thing. So it's very specific.
We try to reach the consumers through all the possible platforms that we can think of. We use paper, we use the internet, mobile phones, we use the utilities customer service tools. Programs achieve between 1.5 and 3.5% in energy efficiency for households. We basically need, let's say, three things. The basic engagement that we are achieving now, we probably need smart meters and time of use tariffs. With that, we believe that we could achieve more substantial savings.
Material culture as being one of the crucial elements of the thing that we're looking at when we're exploring energy behaviour. So we're looking here at everything from insulation, heating devices, house characteristics, appliances, even the form of energy that you're using within the household, the business, or at whatever scale you're looking at this problem. Energy practices, and in this element of the model I'm looking specifically at very particularised activities. It's not always necessarily at this level, but things like heat settings, numbers of rooms heated, hours of heating, etc. And then at norms. So what are your norms around your comfort levels, your environmental concern, and so forth. But recognising at the same time that these are continuously interacting. So not only those individual elements of the material culture, the practices and the norms might be worthy of discrete inquiry, but also the influences between them.
In terms of looking at breaking down behaviour, we just looked at some of the main ways in which thinking on behaviour change differs, and this comes out of sort of our empirical background, and we thought as cases of actor, who or what is enacting the behaviour. There's a domain, what influences the behaviour? Is it sort of material? Is it psychological? There's durability, there's how does it relate to different other behaviours? And we've come out with 4 dimensions of a framework for thinking about behaviour change, which is specifically developed with the aid of helping practitioners. One of the interesting things in the sort of reflections on learning that they brought out was a sort of quite interesting interplay in sort of both the models between sort of focusing on individuals and sort of wildly generalisable things.
Incredibly difficult to operate in the real world of politics and policy making. Any movement we make with policymakers, with politicians, into the right direction, into opening up the discussion with us, I think that's a good thing. What I'd like some, all, few of you, especially the ones who are well versed with things like Twitter, to do, is to summarise a behaviour change model of understanding, framework, or discipline in 140 characters or less. So, for example, what does it look like? I actually did ask Richard Thaler to send me a tweet, and he actually did, on nudge, and this is what he wrote: an effort to help humans make better choices as defined by themselves without coercion. Use science, make it easy.
So when we look at human interfaces for smart meters, what is the best design, and how do we go about doing it? And the way that we think of looking at it is to try and depend on a number of key questions. Who is involved? Why are they doing it? What are they actually doing? When is it doing it? And where is it doing it?
Energy, or electricity in particular, is doubly invisible. We need to somehow make energy visible. What we did then in the qualitative aspect is just pick 15 households, and we did in-depth repeat interviews with them. I'm going to focus on their trajectories of engagement. Now, I should say that not every single household went through exactly this process, but these were common stages in which people engage, with the ways in which people engage with this feedback. How people bring these into their everyday lives is fundamental to the kinds of impacts they have on everyday practices. We need to think critically, as we have been doing this morning, about who or what's using energy here. To some extent, it's individuals. We saw that immediate reaction when an individual would go around and switch stuff off. But then that quickly becomes something about whole households. They have to negotiate with the other people they live with. And then it quickly becomes, actually, I'm limited by the practices I want to perform. I can't go any further. If I want to have a cup of tea, I've got to use the kettle. It's helpful, perhaps, to take a longer-term perspective when thinking about behaviour change interventions. The meaning and use of these monitors actually changes over time. They aren't static things that have a simple relationship to everyday life. They start off as interesting and educational, then they become fundamentally limited, annoying, and then they end up in the trash can. They end up as rubbish. And this point is a fairly simple one around the broader context, and I actually agree with Elizabeth here that it makes very little sense to separate practices from their broader context, because what we see here is that the social and political context, for want of a better term, is fundamentally embroiled in everyday life. It's fundamental to how people use and understand these things and whether or not they react to them.
System efficiency. This is why smart grids are coming about. If you have a practices approach which takes into account the interaction, the hardware, the software, and the practices, and not just the practices of end users, but the practices of regulators, the practices of utilities, the practices of people in government, then you can start to capture this sort of thing, I think. And you need to analyse them all together.
The information that you get from a smart meter, in particular, I suppose, an in-home display, to be precise in my language, should be linked in some way, and yet to be determined, to practices. So it's less about how much, it's this idea that your meter is telling you per second what your kilowatt-hour usage is on your washing machine, which is information that's, probably physicists have a hard time working out, never mind, your average householder. Rather than understanding, well, how much energy does it take to wash? But also there's the idea of the technologies that are built onto smart meters being sort of kind of curtailment technologies in some way. And if you can link this narrative around energy saving being aspirational to it also improving your quality of life, you're into a bit of a sweet spot.
Advise people to take the opportunities they have to work really closely with economists, because they view the same problem from a slightly different angle, and I think that brings new light to the problem.
significant behaviour changes seem to need to have to appeal to pre-existing deep-seated values. So then we thought about the ethics of trying to change behaviour and norms, and the concept of fairness as a driver for change. We then went on to talk about how much support you need before you can implement new regulation and that kind of thing, and the fact that the level of support for government intervention in life in general is rather low compared to what it might have been in the past, so that's a bit of an issue.
If you're trying to do a system analysis, though, it isn't life, the universe, and everything, and you do need to determine what the boundaries are of the system that you're investigating, and also identify which components are the most interesting ones to look at.
Kick-started things, and basically his question was, you know, will DSM save us? And the unanimous response was no, but it's an essential step along the way. So there was kind of consensus that we absolutely have to have sort of various DSM approaches, and that it buys us time, if you like, to fundamentally change our lives in a way that is compatible with an 80% reduction by 2050. So it buys us some time, but it's not going to fundamentally change.
So what is the burden of proof or burden of evidence that policymakers require to know what works? And in this context, often what works might come from, you know, a very small and qualitative study with a particular sort of self-selecting group of participants. Maybe put the question back to you, when you're, you know, when people are telling you this works, you should try this and sort of give it a whirl, sort of sense. What is the burden of proof that you require?
Have a look at the, have a look at the evidence that they're based on. So, you know, without going through all the policies and doing that, I think actually when you look, if you were to do a social study on policy making, you would find that there is a request for very robust evidence, but in the end, policy decisions are not necessarily based on strong evidence. And you know, one example which I can give, because it's nothing to do with my department, but in the US, if you look at the legislation around acid rain and the emissions rules, basically, the regulations that were introduced, they spent an awful lot of time messing around trying to get strong evidence, and in the end kind of did something that was kind of convenient and wasn't really about the evidence in the end and the use. But I think as you know, you're the social science academic community, it would be a useful area for you to form a view on and to provide some advice to some places like that, because I don't think it's obvious.
Things are already going on without any theoretical, so perhaps that relates to what you just said about the fact that a lot of the models have been discussed less than we potentially expected them to be. And technology is means to an end, and we need to take a very integral, systemic perspective on how all of these issues are interrelated and co-shape each other. And finally, and I'm really sorry if I'm stepping on toes there, sorry. You said that we need to learn from Matt, right?
Yeah.
Yes. We need to learn from economists on how to make things simple. And at least we also need to learn from them how to not oversimplify things. Because I think that is one of the dangers of a lot of economic models, that they have been simplified so much that they are too simple now to actually do good in the world. And Michelle, also in the breakout, you said something like, I think actually the final conclusion of today you said is we just need to talk a lot, constantly, ongoing. Yeah. I don't know if that's typical for you, Michelle. Just wondering. Is this something? This is Dutch. Is this something more of you experience, Adam, for example? Would you be? I'm not going to ask if you benefited from today. I'm going to ask, would you do it again? With us.
talking about drivers and barriers, and of course you have lots of issues which cannot be brought back to the individual level, but it's very much also about society, what car ownership means to people. Again, transport and mobility are part of everyday life and also need to be addressed as such, at least in the beginning and in the end. The use of models of understanding maybe is not so much to choose one or another model, because as said, the models that were used as a basis for the project that Gillian had been involved in did have some impact that has been measured and that can be regarded as successful.
New closing the loop that is required, and that is in terms of the big gap that exists between government aspirations for community activity in behaviour change and DSM and those of the groups themselves. And bridging that requires a range of actors and stakeholders and ultimately very clever people. There's a need to focus on a range of community groups and social networks that don't necessarily have energy or climate change as key priorities, but they do have a sense of cohesion and drive. So if we could tap into that and get them to turn their attention to encouraging their members and members of the broader community to adopt some of these more sustainable practices, there might be some potential in that. And possibilities emerge around creating new local community groups focusing on energy issues and then getting them to link in with some of the existing social networks.
We're wondering about the relationship of theory to this case study, and what was using grounded theory, and that maybe there will be a model, but that will be kind of emergent from the work. There's a model of how the system works, and you showed us a diagram of different actors and different considerations they got, where the tenant fitted and where the landlord fitted and where other people fitted. But I guess that's not a theory of behaviour model so much as a model of the system that you're investigating.
Economic growth is not an evil in itself. You can have economic growth in a sustainable system, and you can have a logic of sufficiency. So what we need to learn is actually how to provide alternative messages, focusing on the fact that the only thing that doesn't change is the fact that everything changes.
For analysis of large amounts of data, and the framework used here was means, motive and opportunity. And when we look at opportunity, we're looking at resources, particularly time, to actually to incorporate the data itself.
So we've seen frameworks with different degrees of explanation embedded in them. Some are more mapping, some are more explanatory. And they seem to be as valuable, if not more valuable, than specific models of change. And that seems to be the case here too.
Together to think about your problem really opens up alternatives, and it's the alternative stories that really are engaging and inspiring and get people to actually start doing things.
There were identity stories. So, for example, example, we were told about the energy cities in Switzerland, and you can do certain things to qualify as an energy city, and then your identity has changed a little bit, and you start developing your own story as an energy city. I think we saw a bit of an identity shift story happening this summer in this country with the Olympics opening ceremony. Even happy and achieving people, and it lifted the mood of the whole nation, and we'll see how long that lasts. But you know, it was quite impressive what happened there, I think. Looking at the future and the sort of stories we want to be telling, we wanted to be able to tell stories that are powerful because they're generic and they're not just project specific, but that they have a sort of universality about them. And as academics or as researchers, that certainly you would think that would be part of our role. We wanted to be generating collective stories, interdisciplinary stories, that can be built up through partnerships with intermediaries and iteration and testing.
I will, to close this loop, I will say, what is a model? A model is not a tool, as engineers think. It's not, you know, only predictive modeling, rigid things. It's just a social representation of the reality. So behind that, it's the question of under which point, under which level do we simplify, do we reduce the reality to, at the same time, make it more understandable for people, but not going too far in the simplification to make it just not relevant.
Already at the beginning of day one said, actually models, they come in all sorts, and some of them are useful for different times, different skills, different questions. So I'm very happy that where we started on day one is also where we end on day two. I hope we have learned something in between. I think so.